Right, thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen, and it's nice to have the opportunity to address the Bus Industry Confederation Annual Conference. This is the second time I've addressed the Bus Industry Conference. The first was in Hobart probably about 10 years ago. In fact, this date was for my President of the Australian Local Government Association, Mayor David O'Loughlin, but he couldn't be here today, and so I'm the substitute. And the title that was given for today's presentation was The Role of Transport Operators and Local Government in Smart Cities, Regions, Land Use Planning, Integrated Transport and Service Needs. And quite frankly, that's too big a topic. It's got too many issues. I'd run the risk of being repetitive with our next speaker, Bronwyn, and Stephen. And so I'm actually going to do something else. And that is, I'm actually going to talk about a little more about local government from a national perspective, and particularly what our priorities are in terms of transport issues in the forthcoming federal election. This is a political year, and this is an interesting environment. And then I will touch on some case study examples of councils and how buses integrate in their communities. I'll leave it to my colleague from the National Growth Area Alliance to cover transport-oriented developments in growth areas. And it is worth reminding ourselves a little bit about local government from a national perspective. It's important to remember how diverse local government actually is. There are 537 councils across Australia, and they vary enormously in terms of size, population, and financial capacity. Our largest council in population terms is Brisbane, with about 1.1 million people. By contrast, Murchison in WA has just over 100 people. In terms of area, our largest council is East Pilbara, with an area of 380,000 square kilometres, which is almost exactly the same size as Japan. The difference, of course, is Japan has 127 million people and Pilbara's got 7,000. Our smallest council by area is Peppermint Grove in Perth, which is about 1.1 square kilometre, which is smaller than Monaco. In governance terms, local governments are creatures of the state governments, and their roles and responsibilities are defined by state legislation. There are about 150 types of services and infrastructure provided by local governments, although not all councils obviously provide all their services. There are differences, substantial differences between councils, and there are differences between states. They all provide infrastructure, however. And for many councils, roads and bridges are the biggest expense they bear. Now, to meet this expense, we rely on our revenue streams, and rate revenue is our most significant revenue stream. We raise about 37% of our revenue through that stream, and yet it hasn't kept pace with the demands on local government. Councils generally use rates to meet their budgeted expenditure requirements, and so we work out what we need, and then we set our rates. So there are no windfall gains from unexpected property value rises, unlike the other two levels of government, who do enjoy windfall gains through things like income taxes and stamp duties. The capacity to raise sufficient revenue from rates is a constant challenge for many councils with small rate bases, and the variation between councils in terms of rating ability is enormous. Let me give you a couple of examples. Now, we talked about Murchison a moment ago. Well, in terms of operating revenue, Murchison, it's in regional Western Australia, raised just 3.5% of its budget from rates in 2017. By contrast, operating grants and subsidies from other levels of government accounted for 91% of Murchison's revenue. Burke Shire Council, we heard about someone from Burke today, in northwestern New South Wales raised 13% of its operating revenue from rates and about 50% from grants. Waverley in Sydney, Bondi Beach territory, raised 41.5% through rates, 7% from grants, so much smaller in the metropolitan areas. And the Council of Prospect, where my president comes from, which is in metropolitan Adelaide, raised more than 85% of its revenue from rates, and just 8% from grants. So the capacity to raise additional rates varies substantially. And then councils in New South Wales and Victoria face rate capping. And does that make life harder? It certainly does. ALGA's own research from 2015 confirms the difference in outcomes which would have occurred in New South Wales if we hadn't had rate capping, and it's been in place for 40 years, since 1977. In a comparison of rates per capita in 2014, New South Wales rates were 72% of average rates elsewhere in Australia. If we look at the 10-year period between 2004-5 and 2014-15, rate revenue per capita in New South Wales, adjusted for inflation, increased by just 4.5% over the whole of that period, which compares with an average of around 27% for the rest of Australia. And what does that mean in revenue terms? It means that there's a gap in New South Wales rate revenue of about $2.1 billion per annum. New South Wales councils would potentially raise that extra revenue to be spent on infrastructure and the needs of their communities. Over a 15-year period, from 1998-9 to 2013-14, the loss of that revenue is about $14 billion. And you can certainly address a lot of infrastructure with that. And do we have an infrastructure gap at local government level? We certainly do. We did our own research in 2006, which put the gap at more than $14 billion. And today, it's probably about 25. Sorry? Right. Telephone call. Okay. It has increased since then. ALGA's own State of the Assets reports in 2015 suggest that about 11% of our non-financial assets, infrastructure, owned by local government is in poor to very poor condition. Potentially that's infrastructure worth about $45 billion. You can see from that figure, we have local roads infrastructure valued at about $180 billion. So what do we know a little bit about local government? Well, our expenditure, our industry is worth around $36 billion a year, and it's been increasing. You can see the figures there from 1996 up to 2017. But over the time, our financial sustainability has been seriously eroded. We actually have a very high proportion of the public sector assets in this country. About 33% of the nation's non-financial public assets, but we collect around 3.6% of tax. We have one tax, and that's our local rates. There are 125 taxes in Australia. So that does make us very reliant on transfers from other levels of government. And yet, those governmental transfers have been declining in real terms now for at least 20 years. And every government of every political persuasion has allowed this to happen. Our biggest source of funding from other levels of government is our financial assistance grants. Now, the unfortunately named FAGs, but that's life. So we receive around about $2.45 billion in FAGs currently. They're usually indexed each year in an effort to maintain some of their values, but that indexation was frozen for 3 years in that horror budget of 2014-15, and that freeze has led to a permanent reduction in those grants of nearly $300 million a year. The vast majority of those funds go to rural councils, rural, remote and peri-urban councils. And in 95-96, the value of those grants was 1% of the Commonwealth's tax revenue. Now they're down to about 0.55%. Now this conference comes at an interesting time in terms of national politics. There's a by-election on Saturday the 20th of October in the seat of Wentworth, and the government's majority hangs by a thread, and so the result is very important for government. In fact, it may play a role in determining when the next federal election occurs. Barring a sudden election brought on by a successful vote of no confidence if the government actually loses Wentworth, most of the pundits seem to think that we've got two options: the end of February or May. Regardless of the date, we're going to be ready as a sector. That's what we're calling for from the major political parties, a commitment to deliver for local communities through a partnership with local government. You know, from our point of view, all politics is local. And that's what we've called our document. And we've identified 12 ways, 12 initiatives that we want to look at. I'm going to talk briefly about the priorities which relate most to your industry. And those are the priorities which relate to our ability to provide the services and manage our infrastructure. And so there's only 6 of them we'll have a bit of a talk about. The first one, from our perspective, of course, is to restore those Commonwealth financial assistance grants to 1% of tax revenue. down now, as I said, to only 0.55%. And we face constraints on our rate revenue, and so the financial assistance grants are essential. The value of our assets, our non-financial assets, is put at $408 billion by the ABS. So 33% of all those government assets, with just 3.6% of the tax revenue to maintain it. That's a tough ask. The second initiative we have actually relates to the first mile, last mile problem on Australia's freight routes. Now, that's a major issue that industry keeps raising because of the bottlenecks and inadequate infrastructure. And there's a high return on investment in such problem areas, and fixing those bottlenecks. It is fundamental to our national productivity. It comes up in things like the current review of the freight and supply chain from industry. And we know that while the Commonwealth and states are investing in the national freight network, there's that first mile, last mile issue which also needs to be addressed. And councils, quite frankly, don't have the resources to address those issues. The third issue, of course, is to look at our local roads, specifically through the Roads to Recovery program, which was a very important program introduced in 2001. It currently provides around $350 million to councils across Australia for their roads, specifically tied to road expenditure. It's going to rise to $400 million next year. We're seeking that it be doubled to $800 million, and actually currently it's about $800 million. There was a deal done a few years ago with the reintroduction of fuel excise, which saw that program substantially increased, and it's been of great assistance to local governments in dealing with the problems that we have on our local roads, the roads which your buses use. In terms of infrastructure, local networks, local roads, are just under 75% of our network. So around 662,000 kilometres of roads are managed by councils. As I said, State of the Assets report tells us about 11% of it is in poor to very poor condition. We've proven over many years that our backlog, in terms of addressing those roads, isn't really going to be resolved through CPI increases to our assistance. And now to our boost, Roads to Recovery boost, that we've currently got is welcome, but we want that to continue. We'd also like to make the Bridges Renewal Programme permanent. That's a great programme introduced by the government a few years ago to help us address those old bridges which caused such a problem. They were built before today's design standards are in place, and they restrict heavy vehicle use. Therefore, they constrain national productivity, not to mention create a problem for road safety. Base level funding for that program is about $60 million, and we'd like to see it made permanent and increased. I'll briefly just mention climate change. It's in the newspapers today, and it's topical for us. We're looking for a partnership fund of around $200 million over 4 years to help councils deal with the adaptation issues that they need to deal with in climate change. This isn't about mitigation. We'll leave that to the Commonwealth Government to have a conversation about, but this is about dealing with some of the specific issues we face at local levels in terms of potential rises in sea levels, the nature of flood mapping, and the idea of levee banks. Digital transformation, that was actually mentioned in that extended topic. We do actually have a current program in place called the Smart Cities and Suburbs Programme, funded by the Commonwealth with $50 million in funding, but applications have been significantly oversubscribed. There were 176 applications for round one and 49 successful projects announced with funding of $28 million, and there's now a second round. We'd like to see that program continue with expanded funding. And if you look at the sorts of projects that were approved, they included things like smart parking and electronic planning, and applications to measure pedestrian and transport movements and manage traffic. And this was one of the 3 initiatives that was introduced or announced by Malcolm Turnbull in April 2016 when he talked about his Smart Cities program. The 3 elements, of course, were city deals, and I think you heard about those yesterday. This Smart Cities and Suburbs program, and the concept of value capture, which remains an interesting and difficult concept for the states and the federal government to bring to fruition. The idea that those that benefit from the provision of infrastructure should pay. The question is how to capture that. So that remains a little bit of a discussion. Finally, I'm just going to touch on a brief thing for those of interest in South Australia, and that is actually addressing a peculiar road funding anomaly, the sort of thing that creeps into federal funding programs, and you think, why? But nevertheless, it's worth about $20 million a year, which is a tiny little sliver of the government's program for infrastructure, but it will fix a decade-old injustice. South Australia has 11% of local roads, it has 7% of the population, and gets 5.5% of funding. Something went askew with the methodology of distribution of funds. There's been a fix in place, a temporary fix on and off for about a decade, and really there's a chance to make it permanent. So our bottom line thing that we'll be seeking, in fact, is, we've mentioned it, that 1% plus partnerships. That is the headline campaign message that we have. Why is that? Well, because our federal government is incredibly efficient as a tax collector. It collects 80% of taxes, and yet it's responsible for a much lower proportion of the tasks for government. Now, they solved the distribution issue for the states by giving them the GST. They used to have financial assistance grants as well, but it morphed into the GST. The GST is now worth $67 billion and has grown significantly because it grows with the economy. For local government, we're stuck with something else. So we're looking to try to solve our issues. And in terms of partnership programs, we are an amazingly effective deliverer of programs and partnership projects for the Commonwealth. We've delivered over 60,000 projects with co-funding from the Commonwealth in the last 17 years, with barely a hint of trouble. We know what we're doing, we make decisions in the full light of public scrutiny, and we spend money wisely and we get on with it. We're exactly the sort of partner the Commonwealth government needs to build a nation safe for today and fit for tomorrow. But we do need some sustainability of core funding. So that's the central component of what we're asking for. And we're going to make a case through all of our councils, all 537 of them. We'll be engaging directly with their local candidates to put forward our views. All right. So that's the environment in which councils face. And having given you what I think is a reasonable picture of the environment facing local government, let me turn now to this part of the presentation, because councils, of course, seek to ensure, as much as they can, that there are bus services available to their communities. All of you will be engaging directly with your councils. They have transport strategies in place, and they recognise that council plays a major role in providing the infrastructure that your industry needs. That's 662,000 kilometres of local roads. We spend about $5.4 billion on local roads every year. And the importance of bus transport is particularly the case in regional and remote councils. And of the 537 councils, about 2/3 are regional councils. I've talked about the resource challenges impacting on local councils, and these challenges are most acutely felt by those regional and rural councils. And those are the councils where public transport is most important, and where for the communities is such a major challenge. These are the councils which are making efforts to provide community bus services to augment public bus services provided by the state governments. They're the councils which are engaged with their regional neighbours in looking at regional transport plans. We might just have a quick look at a couple of councils and what they do. Noosa Shire Council, of course, here in Queensland, it has an overarching transport strategy stretching for a 10-year period. It does provide there are 4 types of bus services provided, although the council's really only available, in a sense only involved, in providing the first of those services, the free local bus services, which include free community bus services for local respite and disability access, and a free service which is procured and operated by the council during the peak periods of Christmas and New Year. There's a local bus service, of course, operated by the Queensland Government through TransLink. The council is engaged with TransLink on an ongoing basis in terms of issues such as network reviews, minor changes to services, upgrading bus stops, and advocating for electric bus trials. There's a school bus service, also operated by the state government, and the council provides some infrastructure. You can see it there, the bus shelter and transit centre, for the interstate and intrastate bus services. Swan Hill in Victoria. Again, a similar story, with free local buses provided by volunteer services, including buses from small surrounding towns to Swan Hill. a local bus service managed by Transport for Victoria. The Council is involved in the reviews, providing bus stops and advising the government on new growth areas. There are school bus services, as you would know, provided by the Education Department and State Government, and a private service for interstate and intrastate bus services. Our challenge is, well, planning for those new growth areas and linking regional communities. But the resource limitation faced by all councils, I enjoyed tremendously being here today and listening to some of the conversations, and the suggestion that we needed, as an industry, you needed to align funding between the three levels of government, I think, for demand responsive transport. But there will be a challenge for councils in terms of their ability to actually provide resources, especially in Victoria, which has now introduced rate capping. So resource limitations are something we should always bear in mind for councils. We're at the bottom, in a sense, of the pile for our ability to provide our services, and we're facing an enormous demand by the community and a raised level of expectations, which is not unreasonable. But the reality is we need to find a way of matching our resources to what's being demanded. And of course we also face the challenge of providing accessibility in an equitable way. So I just want to reinforce that councils are incredibly diverse, with different priorities and available resources, but there's a recognition amongst all of those councils and those communities, and there are 6,500 elected members, about the importance of bus transport and the need for it in terms of the economic, social and environmental outcomes it provides and the community coherence it provides for local communities. Thank you.